On April 11, 2001, Borders Group Chief Executive Greg Josefowicz signed a multi-year operating agreement with Amazon.com from the company's headquarters in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Under the terms of the agreement, Amazon would take over the operation of Borders.com. Amazon would host the site. Amazon would fulfill every online order Borders received. Amazon would process the payments. And Amazon would keep the customer data, the purchase histories, the email addresses, and the browsing behavior of every person who bought a book from Borders online for the duration of the contract. In exchange, Borders would receive a small commission on each sale and could redirect its capital away from a money-losing e-commerce operation. The company had spent $18 million in fiscal 2000 on Borders.com and generated a fraction of that in revenue. Josefowicz called the Amazon partnership a way to focus on what Borders did best. The stores. Wall Street analysts approved. Borders stock closed up on the announcement. Industry press described the deal as pragmatic. Amazon spokesperson Bill Curry told reporters the arrangement would let Borders customers access the world's largest selection of books through a trusted brand. Amazon's chief executive Jeff Bezos said nothing publicly. Internally, Amazon executives understood exactly what they had just been handed. For the next 7 years, every person who typed Borders.com into a web browser was, in effect, shopping at Amazon. Their addresses, their credit card details, their reading preferences, and their next likely purchase all flowed into Amazon's databases. Borders received the commission. Amazon received the future. Borders had, at that moment, 10 years left as an operating company. To understand what Josefowicz gave away in April 2001, it helps to understand what Borders was. In 2001, Borders Group was the second largest bookstore chain in the United States, behind only Barnes & Noble, and by many measures the most beloved. The company operated 385 Borders superstores and more than 860 Waldenbooks Mall locations across the country. It generated $3.39 billion in annual revenue. It employed roughly 32,000 people. Its stock had been one of the strongest specialty retail equities of the 1990s. Its stores were, in the language of the industry, destinations. A typical Borders superstore in 2001 occupied between 20,000 and 30,000 square feet. It stocked more than 140,000 book titles at any given time, alongside music CDs, magazines from every corner of the world, and a cafe operated in partnership with Seattle's Best Coffee. The average customer spent more than 40 minutes inside. On weekends, families arrived in the morning and stayed for hours. Children sat cross-legged in the picture book section. Adults read magazines they never intended to purchase. Book clubs met in the cafe. Local authors did signings. Musicians performed in the aisles. The stores were designed for that behavior. Borders had pioneered the deep inventory superstore format in the American book industry. An idea imported from a small store, the Borders brothers had opened in Ann Arbor in 1971 and scaled through the 1980s and 1990s under corporate ownership. The retailers that Borders directly competed with, primarily B. Dalton and independent bookshops, carried a fraction of Borders' inventory. A customer who walked into a Borders looking for an obscure poetry translation or a niche academic history had a real chance of finding it on the shelf. That deep inventory was the entire brand promise, and behind it stood one of the most sophisticated book industry proprietary systems ever built. The system was called the Book Inventory System, or BIS. Louis Borders, one of the founding brothers, had developed it in the 1970s to solve a specific problem. No bookstore chain of the time could reliably know what would sell in a given local market. BIS matched local demographic data, historical sales patterns, and title-level performance across every Borders store, and it produced stock recommendations at a title and store level of granularity that no other American bookseller could replicate. Publishers routinely told trade journalists that Borders bought smarter than any other chain in the country. The company's inventory turned faster. Its markdowns were smaller. Its bestseller predictions were more accurate. BIS was, through the 1990s, the industry's single most sophisticated piece of retail technology. Culturally, Borders occupied a specific place in American life. Barnes & Noble was larger and more suburban. Amazon was newer and, in 2001, still primarily an online book retailer. Borders was where a certain kind of literate middle-class American went on a Sunday afternoon. The company had opened its first international superstore in Singapore in 1997 and expanded into the United Kingdom, Australia, and New Zealand by 2000. Its brand carried real weight with publishers, with authors, and with the reading public. This was the company Greg Josefowicz inherited when he became chief executive in November 1999. Not a struggling regional chain, not a broken retail model. The second largest bookstore company in the United States, running the most sophisticated inventory system in the American book industry at a moment when book sales were still growing. That is what makes the April 11, 2001 agreement the pivot moment it is. Josefowicz's did not hand Borders' entire e-commerce future to Amazon from a position of desperation. He handed it over from a position of dominance, because the company that had spent 30 years learning to sell books to Americans had decided the internet was a distraction from what it did best. The company that ended its independent digital future in April 2001 began 30 years earlier in a single small storefront on South State Street in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Tom Borders and Louis Borders were brothers, 5 years apart, both graduates of the University of Michigan. Tom had studied English literature and stayed in Ann Arbor after graduation. Louis had gone to MIT for a master's in mathematics before returning home. In 1971, the two of them opened a used bookstore in a 500-square-foot space near the university campus, funded with roughly $10,000 in family money. They called it Borders Bookshop. The store served a specific customer, University of Michigan faculty and graduate students, who came in looking for academic titles that the campus bookstore could not be bothered to stock. Tom Borders handled the buying and the front counter. Louis Borders, whose mathematical training gave him a particular way of seeing the business, spent the first years working out something no one else in American bookselling had solved. The problem Louis Borders identified was this: a bookstore's inventory decisions were, at the time, made almost entirely by intuition. Store managers guessed which titles would sell in their local market based on personal taste and publisher promotion. They routinely ordered too many copies of books that did not sell and too few copies of books that did. Return rates to publishers ran above 30% industry-wide. Working capital was tied up in unsold inventory. Independent booksellers survived on thin margins because they had no analytical tools to buy more accurately. Louis Borders built one. Through the middle 1970s, he developed what he called an expert system, a mainframe database that tracked title-level sales at every Borders store, matched them against local demographic data from census records, and generated title and store-level stock recommendations. The system used historical sales velocity, publication category, and local buying patterns to predict what a store should carry and in what quantities. It was the first serious application of quantitative retail analytics to the American book industry. By 1985, the Borders brothers had grown their business to 5 stores across Michigan and Illinois, all running the book inventory system. Their turnover rates were faster than any competing bookseller in the country. Their return rates to publishers were half the industry average. Publishers, who tracked these numbers closely, began to treat Borders as one of their most valued accounts despite its small size. A junior category manager at Random House in 1985 could tell you that a Borders store sold literary fiction at nearly twice the velocity of a comparable B. Dalton. The insight that would define the next decade came from Louis's data. The BIS reports showed clearly that deeper inventory, more titles per store, produced disproportionately higher sales per square foot. A store carrying 80,000 titles did not just sell more than a store carrying 20,000. It sold much more, because the customers who came looking for the obscure title bought the popular ones on the same visit. The Borders brothers concluded that the future of American bookselling belonged to the deep inventory superstore. The first true Borders superstore opened in Novi, Michigan in 1985. It occupied 20,000 square feet and stocked more than 100,000 titles, dwarfing any competing bookseller in the region. The format worked immediately. Sales per square foot ran ahead of projections. Customer dwell time exceeded 30 minutes. The store drew customers from more than an hour's drive away. Through the late 1980s, the Borders brothers expanded the superstore concept to Indianapolis, Atlanta, Philadelphia, and the Washington, D.C. area. Every new store ran on the book inventory system. Every one of them outperformed the projections. By 1992, the company operated 21 superstores and generated more than $200 million in annual revenue. That was the year the Borders brothers sold the company. In October 1992, Tom and Louis Borders sold Borders Bookshops to Kmart Corporation for $190 million in cash. Kmart's chief executive Joseph Antonini had, 3 years earlier, acquired the Walden Books mall chain and was assembling what he believed would become the dominant American bookselling operation. Kmart merged Borders and Walden Books under a new holding company called Borders Group, headquartered in Ann Arbor. Tom Borders left the business shortly afterward. Louis Borders stayed involved through the mid-1990s, but eventually departed as well, later founding an early online grocery company called Webvan. Kmart's ownership was brief but transformative. Under Kmart, Borders Group accelerated the superstore rollout dramatically. The company opened dozens of new locations a year, through 1994 and 1995, reaching 116 superstores by the time Kmart, facing its own financial troubles, spun off Borders Group as an independent public company in May 1995. Borders Group listed on the New York Stock Exchange at $14.50 a share and closed its first day at $22. The 5 years that followed were the peak of the company's independent existence. Borders Group opened superstores at a pace of roughly 40 a year. It expanded overseas. It negotiated favorable long-term leases in premium retail locations. It won the account of the U.S. Air Force to operate bookstores on domestic basis. By 1998, the company was generating $2.6 billion in annual revenue and had become one of the most respected specialty retailers in the country. Behind the growth, though, the book inventory system, the analytical engine that had built the whole company, was aging. Louis Borders had built BIS on 1970s mainframe technology. It had been upgraded through the 1980s, but its architecture remained closed, proprietary, and difficult to extend into new domains. It ran the physical stores brilliantly. It could not run a website. And a website, in 1995, was about to become the thing that mattered. The trap was this: Borders had built its dominance on a proprietary inventory system designed for physical stores, and the company that would eventually kill it was building an inventory system designed for a domain Borders technology could not enter. To see how the trap closed, you have to look at Amazon. Amazon.com had launched in July 1995 from a garage in Bellevue, Washington. Its founder, Jeff Bezos, a former hedge fund executive, had chosen books as his opening category for a specific reason. Books were a commodity product, standardized by ISBN, sold at manufacturer set prices, and shipped easily by mail. More importantly, the American book industry contained roughly 3 million titles in print at any given time, of which even the largest physical superstore could stock only 150,000. Bezos understood that an online retailer, holding inventory in a small number of central warehouses, could offer the entire catalog. The physical stores could not. Borders leadership saw Amazon early. Louis Borders, still involved in strategic discussions in 1996, reportedly told colleagues that the online model was a real threat to the superstore economics. The company commissioned internal studies. It watched Amazon's revenue climb from $511,000 in 1995 to $15.7 million in 1996 to $147 million in 1997. By 1998, Amazon was posting more than $600 million in annual sales, most of it in books, and had begun taking share from Barnes & Noble and Borders in specific customer segments. Borders' response was to build its own website. Borders.com launched in May 1998. It was, by the standards of the American book industry, a serious effort. The company hired more than 100 technology staff. It leased warehouse space in California and Tennessee. It integrated the online catalog with the book inventory system so that customers could theoretically check in-store availability from the site. The problem was that BIS had never been designed for online commerce. Its architecture was optimized for weekly reorder cycles across a network of physical stores. real-time availability, search relevance ranking, and personalized recommendation engines, the specific technologies that Amazon was building at industry-defining scale, were not what BIS did. Borders' technology team spent much of 1998 and 1999 attempting to bolt e-commerce functionality onto a system that could not efficiently support it. The site launched slower than Amazon's, offered less sophisticated search, and could not match Amazon's recommendation algorithms. More expensively, Borders was fighting Amazon on Amazon's chosen terms. Amazon had raised more than $100 million in venture capital and was operating at a deliberate loss, funded by a rising stock price to acquire customers and build market share. Its stated strategy was to lose money on every book in order to become the default online bookstore. Borders, a profitable public company answerable to quarterly earnings, could not sustain that kind of loss. The scale of the mismatch became clear in fiscal 2000. Borders.com generated roughly $27 million in revenue that year. Amazon's book business generated more than $1 billion. Borders lost $18 million on Borders.com in the same 12 months. On a call with analysts in late 2000, Yosefowicz described the online business as a strategic priority, but acknowledged the losses were unsustainable at their current trajectory. By early 2001, Borders board was actively discussing what to do about Borders.com. The internal options were, in principle, 3. Continue investing at current levels and hope to close the gap with Amazon. Increase investment substantially, potentially by hundreds of millions of dollars, to build a genuine competitive alternative. Or exit the online business entirely and route online customers through a partner. The first option was already failing. The second required a scale of capital investment that Yosefowicz and the board did not believe the company's stock price could support. The third option, exit, presented a specific choice. If Borders was going to route online customers through a partner, the two available partners were Barnes & Noble, its direct competitor in physical bookselling, or Amazon, its direct competitor online. Yosefowicz chose Amazon. The specific reasoning, as Borders executives explained it in the following weeks, was that Amazon was the neutral technology platform. Barnes & Noble was a physical retail competitor whose online operation was integrated with its stores. Amazon was, in Yosefowicz's framing, a warehouse and a website. It would fulfill Borders' online orders in exchange for a commission and would not, in the company's view, meaningfully compete with the Borders store experience. The framing was wrong. Amazon in April 2001 was not primarily a warehouse. It was becoming an infrastructure company. Its central strategic asset was not its buildings or its inventory, it was its data. Every customer purchase, every search query, every product page view, every abandoned cart flowed into a database that Amazon used to refine its recommendation algorithms, its pricing, and its category expansion. The value of a Borders online customer to Amazon was not the commission Amazon paid Borders on the sale. It was the customer's future purchases, all of which would eventually be made directly through Amazon. The agreement Yosefowicz signed on April 11, 2001, gave Amazon operational control of Borders.com through 2008. During those 7 years, Amazon would process every Borders online transaction, retain the customer contact and payment information, and build a purchase history for every Borders online buyer inside Amazon's own systems. Borders would receive a commission on each sale. Redirected online customers would experience Amazon's fulfillment, and Borders' own e-commerce technology team would be substantially wound down. Yosefowicz framed the deal in the April 11th press release as freeing Borders to focus on its physical stores. The physical stores were, at that moment, still the most profitable specialty book retail operation in the country. The theory was that Borders would win on the sales floor and let Amazon win the online segment, taking a small commission on that side of the business while defending the larger and higher margin store business. The theory contained a specific assumption that would prove fatal. It assumed that the online segment and the store segment were two separate markets, competing for two separate customers. They were not. They were the same market, competing for the same customer, and every year of the agreement handed Amazon another 1 million reasons why that customer would eventually stop coming to the store. Yosefowicz and the Borders board would not fully understand what they had signed until 2008. The agreement with Amazon took effect in August 2001. Borders.com went dark as an independent site that month and was redirected to a co-branded storefront hosted on Amazon's infrastructure. A visitor typing Borders.com into a browser landed on a page that carried the Borders logo, drew from Amazon's product catalog, and processed every order through Amazon's checkout. The Borders technology team that had built and operated the original site was reduced from more than 100 employees to a handful of contract managers. The California and Tennessee warehouses that had been leased for Borders online fulfillment were wound down over the following year. Inside Borders' Ann Arbor headquarters, the immediate consequences looked favorable. The company's e-commerce losses, which had run at $18 million in fiscal 2000, effectively disappeared from the profit and loss statement. Josefowicz reported to analysts that the arrangement was performing to plan. Same-store sales in the superstores grew 3.6% in fiscal 2001. The company opened another 41 superstores that year. On the surface, the strategy of focusing on physical retail was working. Beneath the surface, something else was happening. Every online book purchase made through Borders.com from August 2001 forward was, in operational terms, an Amazon purchase. The customer's shipping address went to Amazon. The credit card details went to Amazon. The purchase history built up inside Amazon's customer database. Amazon's recommendation engine began, over the following months, sending those customers marketing emails, product suggestions, and cross-category promotions for music, electronics, and eventually every other Amazon vertical. By 2003, Amazon had launched what it called its Associates program at massive scale, opened its marketplace to third-party sellers, and begun the expansion into consumer electronics that would define its second decade. Every Borders online customer, still nominally shopping at a Borders-branded site, was being routed through the growing Amazon ecosystem. When those customers eventually shopped for something Borders did not sell, a stereo, a kitchen appliance, a DVD player, Amazon was already there with their address on file. The strategic cost to Borders was not visible in any single quarter. It compounded slowly, and it compounded on the wrong side of the ledger. Borders was not losing money on Amazon.com. It was losing the ability to build an independent digital customer relationship. Every year of the agreement was a year in which Borders' most digitally engaged customers formed their online buying habits inside Amazon's interface, on Amazon's recommendation engine, using Amazon's payment infrastructure. When the agreement finally expired, those customers would not migrate back. There were internal warnings. In 2003 and 2004, a group of Borders executives, including Chief Information Officer Rick Van Zura, argued that the company needed to begin rebuilding independent digital capability. The concern was straightforward. The Amazon deal was scheduled to expire in 2008, and Borders would need a functioning e-commerce operation by then. Building one required lead time, technology investment, and organizational commitment. Van Zura and others recommended beginning the work in 2004. The recommendation was declined. Borders' capital was directed instead toward the physical store expansion, the international superstore rollout, and a major renovation program called Concept 2005 that redesigned store interiors around expanded music and DVD sections. The reasoning was that the physical stores generated more than 95% of Borders' revenue and profit. Investing in a rebuilt e-commerce platform during an active partnership with the industry's dominant online retailer struck the board as strategically unclear. Meanwhile, Amazon was widening the technology gap. In 2002, Amazon launched Amazon Web Services, the internal infrastructure platform that would become the largest cloud computing business in the world. In 2005, Amazon introduced Amazon Prime, a subscription service offering 2-day shipping for a flat annual fee. Prime members, over the following years, would concentrate their online spending inside Amazon at rates that made competing e-commerce operations economically non-viable. In 2007, Amazon launched the Kindle, its first electronic reader, and began the transition of the book industry itself from physical to digital. The Kindle launch is the moment the agreement's cost became structural rather than strategic. Amazon was now transforming the medium that Borders' entire physical retail footprint was built to sell. Borders had no digital reader, no ebook platform, no direct customer relationships in the digital reading segment, and no time left on the calendar. The Amazon partnership had 15 months remaining. In May 2008, Borders finally launched a rebuilt Borders.com under its own operation. The site was thin, its selection limited, and its technology roughly a decade behind Amazon's. It launched into a market in which Amazon held the digital reader category, controlled the online book category, and possessed the purchase history of every Borders online customer from the preceding 7 years. By the time the site went live, Borders was already in financial distress from a series of unrelated decisions. The Concept 2005 renovation program had cost more than $200 million and produced no measurable lift in same-store sales. The international expansion had stalled and would be sold at a loss to a private equity firm called Risk Capital Partners in 2007 for £20 million, a fraction of Borders' original investment. Same-store sales in the domestic superstores had turned negative in 2006 and worsened through 2007. Josefowicz had resigned as chief executive in July 2006, replaced by George Jones, a former chief executive of Saks and Warner Brothers Consumer Products. Jones's mandate was, in effect, to reverse the strategic damage of the Amazon years. He had less than 2 years to do it. He would not succeed. By the summer of 2008, Borders was running out of time on 2 clocks at once. The first clock was operational. The rebuilt Borders.com had launched in May and was generating a fraction of the traffic and revenue the company needed to compete in a book market that Amazon was rapidly digitizing. Same-store sales in the domestic superstores had fallen 3.8% in the first quarter of 2008 and would fall further through the year. The Concept 2005 store renovations had drained more than $200 million from the balance sheet without producing measurable lift. The company was carrying long-term debt of roughly $350 million against declining cash flow. The second clock was financial. Borders' revolving credit facility, held by a consortium led by Bank of America, was up for renewal. The company's covenants had tightened. Vendors, watching the numbers, were beginning to raise questions about payment terms in the way that always precedes a full credit collapse. Onto that situation, in March 2008, walked activist investor William Ackman, whose hedge fund Pershing Square Capital Management had accumulated a 17.8% stake in Borders. Ackman also held a 15.5% stake in Barnes & Noble. His publicly stated view was that the American book industry could no longer support 2 national superstore chains competing against Amazon, and that the 2 chains should combine. Borders' board, chaired by Larry Pollock, began exploring strategic alternatives in March 2008 and formally put the company up for sale that same month. Barnes & Noble chief executive Steve Riggio conducted preliminary due diligence through the spring. The transaction being discussed would have merged Borders and Barnes & Noble into a single national bookseller with roughly 1,500 combined stores and a shared e-commerce operation. In April 2008, Barnes & Noble made an informal offer valuing Borders at approximately $400 million. The Borders board took nearly 3 months to respond. During that period, the credit markets deteriorated sharply. Bear Stearns had collapsed in March. Investment banks were withdrawing from leveraged financing. Consumer discretionary spending was weakening ahead of the broader recession. On June 25, 2008, Barnes & Noble formally withdrew the offer, citing the credit environment and its inability to finance the acquisition on acceptable terms. Ackman continued to advocate publicly for a combination through the fall, but no revised offer materialized. Borders was, at that point, out of commercial exits. The company drew down a $42.5 million loan from Pershing Square itself in April 2008 at a 12.5% interest rate, effectively borrowing from its largest activist shareholder to fund near-term operations. Ackman would extend an additional $25 million in emergency financing in 2009. These loans kept the company solvent through the immediate crisis, but committed Borders to interest payments that further constrained its ability to invest in the digital transition it had failed to make. Ron Marshall, a former Nash Finch chief executive with turnaround credentials, replaced George Jones as chief executive in January 2009. Marshall's plan was to cut costs aggressively. He closed 200 Walden Books mall stores through 2009, reduced corporate headcount, cut inventory, and renegotiated vendor terms. Same-store sales continued to fall. He resigned after less than a year to run Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company. Michael Edwards, a former merchandising executive, took over as interim chief executive in January 2010. Edwards' tenure focused on securing new credit facilities and pursuing a digital reader strategy through a partnership with Kobo, a Toronto-based e-reader company. Borders launched its Kobo-based e-book platform in July 2010. The launch was more than 3 years behind the Kindle. It generated a fraction of the required volume. By late 2010, Borders' vendor credit was collapsing on the same trajectory Circuit Cities had followed 2 years earlier. Major publishers, including Simon & Schuster, HarperCollins, and Penguin Group, began demanding cash on delivery. Trade credit insurers withdrew coverage. Borders skipped payments to publishers in December 2010 and January 2011. On February 16, 2011, Borders Group filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in New York. The filing disclosed $1.28 billion in assets and $1.29 billion in liabilities. It announced the immediate closure of roughly 200 of its 642 remaining domestic stores. Edwards and the bankruptcy team spent the following 6 months attempting to find a buyer. The most credible bidder was Jam Najafi, a private equity investor whose Najafi companies offered to acquire Borders and continue operating it as a going concern for approximately $215 million. The offer was contingent on the bankruptcy court approving Najafi's plan without requiring an immediate liquidation as a fallback. Borders creditors, led by a group of publishers owed hundreds of millions in unpaid invoices, refused to accept the contingency. They insisted on a firm liquidation commitment if the Najafi plan failed. Najafi withdrew the offer on July 17, 2011. On July 18, 2011, Borders Group announced it would liquidate all remaining 399 stores. The going out of business sales began the following week. Books were marked down in stages, 10%, then 30, then 50, then 70, then 90. By early September, the last Borders superstores in America were selling fixtures and shelving. The final Borders store, in Redmond, Washington, closed on September 18, 2011. The liquidation ran from July 22 through September 18, 2011. Hilco Merchant Resources, Gordon Brothers, SB Capital, and Tiger Capital, the same consortium of specialty retail liquidators that had run the Circuit City wind down 2 years earlier, jointly acquired the going out of business rights. They fired the remaining 10,700 Borders employees. Then they hired many of them back at reduced hourly rates to work the closing sales through the summer. Barnes & Noble picked up an estimated 20% of Borders' displaced customer traffic in the weeks following the announcement, according to internal figures its executives cited on subsequent earnings calls. Amazon captured most of the rest. Independent bookstores in cities where a Borders had closed reported small local sales lifts, though not enough to reverse the 2-decade decline in independent bookselling that Borders itself had accelerated. The intellectual property was sold off in pieces. Barnes & Noble paid $13.9 million in September 2011 for the Borders brand name, the customer database, and the Borders loyalty program membership list, which contained approximately 48 million email addresses. Barnes & Noble did not attempt to relaunch the Borders brand. It sent the loyalty database a single email inviting former Borders members to shop at Barnes & Noble. The migration rate was measured in single-digit percentages. The Kobo partnership survived the collapse. Kobo itself was acquired by the Japanese e-commerce company Rakuten in November 2011 for $315 million. The technology Borders had leased in 2010 to enter the e-reader market went on to become the second-largest global e-reader platform outside Amazon. Borders received none of that upside. The 508 Borders superstore locations that closed through 2011 followed a familiar pattern. Books, a million, a smaller regional bookseller, took over roughly 41 of them. Barnes & Noble opened stores in a handful of the strongest markets. Ross Dress for Less, Nordstrom Rack, and Whole Foods absorbed many of the remaining large-format spaces. In Ann Arbor, the original Borders storefront on South State Street, opened by Tom and Louis Borders in 1971, sat vacant for 2 years before being leased to a clothing retailer. Louis Borders had, by then, moved on to other ventures. His online grocery company, Webvan, which he had founded in 1996 after leaving Borders, had itself become one of the most famous business collapses of the dot-com era, filing for bankruptcy in July 2001. 3 months after Josefowicz had signed the Amazon deal, Tom Borders remained in Ann Arbor, largely out of the public eye. Greg Josefowicz had left Borders in 2006 and taken board seats at several public companies, including PetSmart and Marsh Supermarkets. He did not run a public company again. In interviews given to trade publications after the bankruptcy, he defended the 2001 Amazon agreement as the correct decision under the operating conditions of the time. He argued that Borders lacked the capital to compete directly with Amazon and that the partnership had freed the company to focus on physical retail. What he did not address was the 7-year gap the agreement had opened between Borders and independent digital capability, or the compounding customer data advantage it had handed Amazon during those 7 years. Amazon in 2011 was a $48 billion revenue company. In 2001, when the Borders deal had been signed, it had generated $3.12 billion. The overlap in reading customers between the two companies was, by 2011, substantially total. The Ackman investment was written down. Pershing Square disclosed losses on its Borders position in the range of $125 million across the two funds that had held the stake. Ackman's public statements after the bankruptcy focused on the strategic error of the failed 2008 Barnes & Noble merger, which he continued to argue would have saved both companies. Barnes & Noble itself would spend the following decade struggling to compete with Amazon before being taken private in 2019 by hedge fund Elliott Management for $683 million. The book inventory system, the analytical engine Louis Borders had built in the 1970s to solve a specific problem in physical retail, was decommissioned during the bankruptcy proceedings. The mainframe code, the underlying data models, and the accumulated 3 decades of American book industry sales history were retained by the estate for a period of legal record and then permanently retired. The system that had made Borders the smartest buyer in American bookselling had never learned to sell a single book online. Today, Borders exists as a brand name owned by Barnes & Noble, which has never used it. It operates no stores. It employs, in any capacity connected to the Borders name, 0 people. At its peak in 2003, Borders Group employed 35,600. The Borders loyalty database, once 48 million active readers, sits in Barnes & Noble servers as historical record. The superstore concept that Tom and Louis Borders drew up in Ann Arbor in the 1970s still shapes American bookselling. The deep inventory format, the cafe integration, the community reading spaces. Barnes & Noble runs them. Independent booksellers run smaller versions. The concept outlasted the company that invented it. This is not a story about a company that failed to see the internet. Borders launched its own e-commerce site in 1998, spent $100 million on digital operations across 3 years, and understood in detail what Amazon was building. This is a story about what happens when a company decides that the future is not what it does best, and rents its digital storefront to the competitor that will inherit it. The 2001 Amazon agreement was not a mistake of ignorance. It was a mistake of category. Josefowicz and the Borders board treated the online business as a separate market that could be outsourced to a partner, while Amazon treated it as the same market and used the partnership to accumulate 7 years of customer data on Borders' own readers. Every year of the agreement compounded on the wrong side of the ledger. When the contract expired in 2008, Borders inherited a rebuilt website. Amazon inherited the customer. A company can survive missing a technology transition. It cannot survive handing its future customers to the company that will replace it, then billing the transaction as focus.